And we are live, and welcome to a special edition of the Qué Pasó podcast, episode 15.
Okay.
Um, Thank you guys for coming on again, as always, our wonderful co hosts.
Mm-hmm. How are you?
Great, everything great. I am Eduardo.
I'm Ozymandias.
I'm Ernest, and today is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War One, a particularly destructive conflict which killed millions and millions of people, destroyed countless lives, and destroyed nations. And in some circumstances, not the nations that you think. And we will be covering that as best we can because I mean this is a long and great topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed it is. I mean, it's the a conflict that had a lot of repercussions up to this day, and sometimes in some aspects, I think it was in a more important, well, not more important, but more with the consequences were more strong than the consequences of World War II.
I kind of agree with that point because you have to consider that World War One, many things we know today that exist come from that period. I mean, let's imagine the planes. The first plane, I think the first plane was from like 1911, and by 1916, I think the planes were already a common sight on the battlefields of Europe. And you have to think about it that this was a time in which planes were made out of wood and I think it was canvas.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
was.
and we're actually talking about the war and uni, and an important topic that important like consequence about this war is that this was the war that not only ended. I mean, everyone said is the war that will end all wars. No, in my opinion, this was the war that ended every major empire as we know it. I mean, yeah, the British Empire still existed, but after that, but it wasn't the same superpower that it was before.
Indeed, it was, and also it it was the point where the triumphalism of the modern era came crashing down and gave way to the what we now call the postmodernism and its nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So, to start with this, I would like to guys, what do you say if we this can put a picture, well, paint the picture of how the world looked in 1914. I mean, who were the major players? I mean, I think England by the time was the first world power in the world,
It was the
It was.
superpower.
the superpower, yeah. And of course there were France that has a maybe not, it wasn't a monarchy, but they have a big colonial empire and a big industry, and and they were thriving after some turmoil in the last quarter of the 19th century. Or
No, we also have to look at the like the Ottoman Empire was one that was a little bit behind still.
The
yeah,
Um,
I think
on its
they
prospects.
nicknamed it the old man of Europe.
Hmm.
It was
the
like
sick
a
man. It was the sick man of Europe, actually,
this,
is what they.
Yeah,
thanks, the segment of Europe. I mean, it was one of the largest, one of the oldest empires by then. By that point, I think it was like during the 1800s, the Greeks had revolted against them, and Greece was an independent country. They've lost a war, the War of Crimea. They fought in the War of Crimea, remember? But I remember that the only reason why the Ottoman Empire still existed was because countries like Britain and France needed it to hold the Russian advance, because they knew that if Russia got access to the Mediterranean, it would be a major superpower.
I think well the thing with Russia was that Russia was a threat not because of the skill of its officers or the quality of its arms. It was just the manpower.
Yeah.
Russia had a lot of people,
They
and they
have
could
not.
just
Mhm.
throw them at you.
They not
Yeah,
have rifles, but they had people.
they
Well,
had
yeah,
exactly, and they by the start of the war they had the biggest army in the world without, and they were not they didn't have a colonial empire like the British or the French or any other super major power. They were themselves for themselves, and they could feel if the circumstances were optimal at a high point 15 million troops, but that never came to happen. You
But you
know,
see all the caricature maps that like there is this funny maps about they got a cartoon. I think every map shows the Russians like an octopus or like a guy or like a monster eating everything that it sees. Let
well,
me see if I can.
the British were always a bit scared of the Russians. I mean, and well, not scared of them, but they were concerned
yeah,
because of you see, because Britain and Russia were rivals for the Middle East. In what was called the Great Game.
exactly.
Mhm.
And that resulted in proxy wars. The British fighting in Afghanistan, not the current one, but the
But before,
1830s. Um, and it actually was a stunning defeat. But now, when the Indian Rebellion in '57 came about, the British feared, and rightly so, that the Russians were involved in attempts to stir up the native population, and that if they didn't finish this mutiny quickly, that the Russians were going to come and seize India. Now, if they did, I mean, you combine the population of India at that time with the Russian military and the Russian population at the time, you would have had a literal unstoppable juggernaut. Um,
Totally.
because the manpower is all Russia really relied on. Um,
yeah,
Now, that doesn't always work. I mean, if we're looking at beforehand, the Russo-Japanese War was a massive black eye for the Russian army. Um,
And
it
it was like the revelation of one of the up and coming powers in the world,
hmm
as in the case of the Japanese.
Well, the
Oh,
Japanese were they were a they rose quickly, but they fell quickly too. Really, if you think about the span of empires, their their twilight was World War II and just before it.
Yeah,
And, well, it was from, I should say, it was from the Sino-Japanese War. The Russian was when they really started getting attention. The Russo-Japanese War was when they showed themselves that they could beat a Western power. Which, I mean, Russia was the weak kid on the block at the time. I mean, their army was corrupt and incompetent. Their navy wasn't much better.
also consider the where the soldiers came about. Most Russian soldiers, and this is something I watched in the documentary. Most Russian soldiers were illiterate uh, town folk who farmed the land. They didn't know how to read or write. They were
They were
people
serfs.
that were serfs, very simple people. And when you compare that to the people they fought, for example, in World War One, when they fought the Germans had the most professional army in Europe at that moment.
Yep.
So
and
you're so there. So I think it makes sense in the later time why the Russian Revolution came about, considering that the monarchy proved inefficient at defeating Russia's enemies. So when someone comes about and says, I can rule it better than the Tsars," they will say, "Oh, whatever, we'll give it a try."
But
also you see the in that Russo-Japanese war, the extension of the Russian Empire and its geography literally was their main. I think it was one of their main weaknesses
Mhm.
because they didn't have a in the Pacific. They were looking for a warm water harbor. That in this case was Port Arthur, but I think it was really shallow and couldn't hold a major fleet there. And
yeah, no, it couldn't. And the thing is that the Japanese is that also too. I mean, to move troops to Siberia, towards Vladivostok, toward the south and into Manchuria, and that. I mean, that
It's
took
a very long trek.
it's a long trip. It took a long time, and you can't ferry massive amounts of soldiers. You can ferry couple thousand at a time. But I mean, you can only move so many trains along these railways and through. And I mean, if you try to march them, my God, you'll never get them there in time. The only thing the Russians could rely on was the Black Sea Fleet, and that was destroyed.
Yeah, and it wasn't used. They give they went all the way around Africa because the British didn't let them use the Suez Canal. But going to the other powers, major powers that play a part in this war. What about the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians?
Yes, that I mean the Germans at the time were the rising power. Were the I mean, they were a superpower, technically.
Young and violent. They were like the new kid on the block.
Well, they were. I mean, they were hungry for expansion. They wanted, a greater share of Africa, as opposed to the British and French.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that they were aggressive. You saw gunboat diplomacy in action in
the Agadir crisis.
Yep, you did.
Yeah, Morocco. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a few other things there. I mean, but it wasn't that there is now. Then you also have Austria-Hungary, which went through a series of reforms as it needed to.
Can I mention something about Austria-Hungary I think it's something that it really because I remember that it was Otto von Bismarck that says that the Balkans were like
powder cake.
Yes, they were powder cake, and it was just needed a single spark to start a fire. And when you start reading into it, he was right. The Balkans are a place full of ethnic division between guys who hate themselves out of religion, out of I don't know. The Greeks hate the Turks. The Bulgarians hate the Turks. Then you have the Serbians who want to join all the Serbs, and you have a huge problem when it comes about the problem of ethnical division. And top of that up, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, most people, the thing here was that the Austrians enforced, let's say, German culture, their culture, Austrian culture, above all of them. And this is something that caused a lot of friction with many groups. And as we will see later with the assassination of the Archduke, it was one of the catalysts of several resistance movements or terrorist organizations like the Black Hand.
Yeah, in this case, everything began in 1908 when Franz Joseph decided to annex Bosnia to the empire, and it was not a decision that everybody was pleased with, because all the other major powers actually criticized him for that. Also, I mean, being the empire that they were, it's Austro-Hungary was like the last reminiscence of the late Middle Age, or the Middle Ages. I mean, a family that inherits a lot of land and becomes the ruler over it. I mean, they could have formed part of the German Empire, but as well, everything fell apart after the war of Austria versus Prussia and the Battle of Königgrätz. But for who else? And the almost unknown. I think we only have to mention the almost unknown by the time, the United States.
Oh yes,
but I mean, the United States was the military wasn't that big. Their army and their industrial complex, like for producing arms and equipment, and that wasn't that developed. Their later entry into the war was it was kind of rushed, but they managed to pull it off. I mean, because their experience were mostly the Pancho Villa expedition, which I mean is not what
the Spanish-American War.
Yes, but I mean that that mode of combat was completely different than to what World War I was. Um, you had mostly amphibious warfare going on with the United States in the Spanish American War. Because I mean, you had to bring troops into Cuba, you had to bring troops into the Philippines, you had to bring them into Puerto Rico. It was a very aquatic war. It was more naval than anything.
Okay.
And also, the Spanish are not the Germans.
Exactly.
Spain,
Oh, exactly.
Spain was essentially a corpse at the time. I mean, when they fought the Battle of, I think it was Havana, or was it was it the Battle of Havana?
Santiago, I think.
Santiago, yeah, Santiago, yes. Sorry. Their main flagship didn't have one of its main cannons. They got rid of it for budgetary reasons and corruption.
Sounds
So
like Spain.
it does.
It
And
sounds
then,
like Spain.
I mean, they couldn't even hold off in the Philippines. Well, they held off a bit in the Philippines, and then the Filipinos rose up and dealt with
The
them.
Katipunan.
There's actually a good movie, really quickly. It's called the last of the Filipinos.
Oh yeah,
Um,
the 1898. I saw
yeah,
it.
that's a great movie.
Yeah.
I got to admit that is for a Spanish movie, it's really good. But anyway, no, so that's on my recommends of a movie to watch.
Um,
Because while it is not the Great War, it's still a good movie.
well, another major event that build up to the war. I think is worth mentioning was the scramble for Africa. What do you think
Yeah.
about it?
I think. Oh, go ahead, Pablo.
Oh, sorry, but okay. So, I mean, we were actually reading about this in uni. So, the scramble for Africa. Well, this had to do, of course, with the idea of colonialism that I won't spend too much time talking about because I think that by now everyone knows exactly what it is. But mostly, I remember that correctly, is the fact that when the Europeans entered in Africa, the first one to go in were the French and the British. And I think that by 1940, most of Africa was owned by British and French. I think the Italians had Libya, the Spaniards had, I think, Morocco and some northern enclaves like Ceuta,
Yeah,
and the Portuguese had also some places, and the
Angola and
the
Mozambique.
Angola, and also, and this is this is actually like a fun fact. The Congo, which was for a long time the Belgian Congo. This is something I didn't knew at the moment, but the Congo was many people nicknamed the Congo as the personal like hacienda of the king of Belgium, because
Yeah,
it was his own his own. In fact, the capital city is still called Leopoldville.
Leopoldville.
Yes, in honor of him. Let me see if I can.
Now it's called Kinshasa.
Yes,
Kinshasa, yeah,
that actually has funny. It was like an attempt of Mobutu of Africanize the country. Funny thing, he changed the name of Congo to Zaire, which Zaire is a name that comes from a Portuguese mispronunciation of a river. That's quite African. But consider this. I mean, by 1960, the Belgian Congo was like 2 million square kilometers, and I think that was the largest colony in terms of size that European power ever held. And if something I remember, the Germans arrived late. They had like few colonies. I think it was like Equatorial Guinea. I think.
It was Togoland, Cameroon, Namibia, well, German West Africa, and the colonial part of Tanzania or Tanganyika, also Rwanda
There
and
was
Burundi.
there was also like Bechuanaland. I think it was the name.
I I don't think, but when you're talking about Equatorial Guinea, that was actually Spain.
Spaniard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes. There's also another country which I can't mention the name because I don't want to offend someone. But it was like the name from Liberia, which it was, I think it was part of a territory of Guinea. But you have to say my word for it.
They did own part of New Guinea. Yeah, they did own German Guinea.
Yes.
Um,
I remember that there was a German commander. I think it was Paul Leto von Vorbeck.
Oh yeah, that I we will talk about him here.
Yeah,
It's a really interesting story about his campaign of guerrilla warfare in East Africa.
you're about to say Wakanda. I know you're about to say Wakanda.
but I mean, the war. Now, the quick thing too is that the British Empire, and I have to say this being from one of the former colonies and not Canada, which is also a former colony. But you see, the British Empire was divided up into several dominions and also the British Raj. You had, at the time, the main dominions were Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Newfoundland, which was, strangely enough, an independent nation. Now,
That's curious.
well, yeah, we were an independent nation technically from 1908 to 1934. And then we gave up independence and became a British colony again. But that's another story for another day. But
Mhm.
at the end of this, I will explain how all of this is related to World War One because it actually is incredibly tied to the fate of this former Dominion. But the thing about the Dominions was that they had complete control over they were independent and they had complete control over their internal affairs and military expenditures, but they had no control over their foreign policy. So
Oh yes.
yeah, we were not well, we weren't puppet states. No, we were self-governing we were self-governing states under the auspice of London. Um,
Oh, Britannia, Britannia, rule
exactly.
away.
But
I love that song.
yeah, but they did do this. Like so. At the end of the day, um, when they tell us to fight, we fought. The Canadians fought in the Boer War, sending, I believe, the Royal Canadian Mounted
Really?
Police. Yeah, yeah.
Really? They fought?
Canada was in the Boer War.
I didn't knew
Um,
that. That's incredible.
yeah, but that's and also actually South Africa was technically a dominion, I believe. I'm not
Yeah.
100% if
Oh
it was
yes,
the Dominion of South Africa.
oh yes, I found it. Canadian soldiers fought in the Boer War, which interestingly enough, I remember that I read that this was like this war started 11th of October of 1899 and it finished on 31st of May 1902, which is just like 12 years before World War One. And that's something that I like to point out. If you watch pictures when the war began, every soldier was going with a smile on their face.
Yeah, because
Yes.
they thought the war was going to be over by Christmas.
Yeah, because every one of them they learn about because the only major European war was were the wars of Napoleon, and everyone read about soldiers on gleaming uniforms and cavalry charges, and everyone's thinking, hey, the war is going to be like that. There were going to be a few losses and very heroic deeds. It will be fun, they say, and then you start seeing as the year pass, and then you arrive to 1960, where the trenches start to appear and the faces there are no smiles anymore. I mean,
It's like uh,
it's hell on earth for these men.
it's well as I told to a friend once, the people that back then approached the war like with something that you could call sportsmanship.
Mm, yeah. Okay, so sharing my screen, I found the map of colonial Africa by 1914. As we see, it was pretty much occupied by Europeans as we know it. So the map says so the Spaniards occupy this place, Rio de Oro, which I never knew it existed, and Morocco, Spanish Morocco. This was all the Spaniards held from Africa, except of course Gibraltar that later will be British protectorate. This blob right here is French, and I remember that Algeria, even up to the 1950s, wanted to be part of France. So
Yep.
Gambia So all these are British territories. And okay, so here are the few German territories: the Cameroon, which I remember correctly comes from a word camaroes, which is a Portuguese word for shrimp or lobsters.
Yeah,
Pe- and Southwest Africa and German East Africa. And then, if I remember correctly, the British annexed Southwest Africa and German East Africa, and with that, they successfully joined all their African possessions.
yeah, and also the Cameroon was at first as the actual borders of the Cameroon were, but as Ernest mentioned, with the gunboat diplomacy in the Agadir crisis of the Germans,
Hmm.
aside from being so aggressive, the Kaiser won. I think won the Nobel Prize of Peace because of that, because of the Fusina crisis he provoked, and also got some pieces of Chad, Central Africa, and Gabon that
Okay.
were later called Noi Cameroon, New Cameroon.
Although you have to imagine that all these borders they go across rivers, jungles, mountains. So most of this is just desert. For example, here most of this is just desert.
Yeah, in the French West Africa.
Yeah, and here it is, the real life Wakanda, the Empire of Ethiopia.
But Ethiopia has nothing to do with this war. The Second World War,
Oh yes, they had
yes,
something to do. But when the Italians tried to annex it, but
yeah,
this is
but
not.
that was the Battle of Massawa, was it? I believe. I can't recall, but either way, that was a bit different.
So
Um, I
I was just to close this part.
Yes.
I wanna ask you guys. In this period, you have two of the major powers competing for the same goals. We have the biggest fleet and a great colonial empire.
Hmm.
In this case, the Germans and the British were the ones fighting for it. And I think, well, I think this was an important, catalyst for the war, because the British and the Germans, in they knew that at some point they would
There
have
was,
to,
there was going to be a war.
yeah,
They knew that there were yes, and
like
because this is something I actually read about. The problem when Prussia became the major German state, and when he declared their German Empire, was that now there was a new player on the European political sphere. Because as for that time, the major nations were the British, the French, at some extent the Russians were like a player in some parts, and you got then the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there was like a balance. There was like a so-called balance when it came to uh, superpowers, and then out of the bloom, these squabbling Germanic states just join and create a formidable empire that can move thousands of men on the most effective railway system there in Europe up to the battlefield, and they have the most modern equipment you can get. So of course, I think the British knew something was coming. I think everyone then, even for example, you think in Austria, Hungary, France, Italy, Germany, everyone knew there is something coming, and we're not going to be ready for it.
yeah, and of course we have the newly born nations in the Balkans. I mean, how old was Serbia by the start of the war? Like 50 years?
Oh, it was very young. I think by that time, one of the youngest of all European nations. Interesting to see also the idea of Pan-Slavism, which in essence was one of the reasons why they targeted when some Serbian nationalists targeted the Archduke, was the idea of joining the Pan-Slavia, if I remember correctly. But it was a very but by that time it was a very young country. I mean, when they became independent, I mean, they were seeing this, there were okay. I mean, for example, I mean, the story. By the way, the story of Serbia goes back as to the 8th century. But when they nationally unified, I mean, they became independent from the
Ottomans.
Serbians like in 1912.
Yeah, and well, of course, there was the imperial ambitions of Austro-Hungary were at odds with um, the Ottomans, and in this case, with the annexation of Bosnia,
Mm-hmm.
they 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 wanted to keep digging in sorry in into the Balkans, and well, and then this fateful day of August in no July, it was July, right, or June?
When they killed the
June.
Archduke.
Yeah, it in June 1914 that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand von Habsburg went to Sarajevo to some state visit. Well,
Yeah, he
many.
survived. He survived an attempt on his life. That is funny. He survived an attempt on his life, and I remember that his whole entourage, his guards, they say, "Please stay here and then resume the visit in the morning. We have cleared out all this." And he said no, and he went through another road. And this is the funny thing: he went through another road where no one was expecting anything. In fact, the boss, the Serbians who wanted to kill him, were expecting him on another street. And Gavrilo Princip, this unknown Serbian nationalist, he was just standing there on a cafe, and he sees a car, and he recognizes the Archduke, and without a doubt, he runs, pulls up an FN pistol, a pistol Belgian manufacturer, that according to
Fabrique
some.
Nationale. Yeah.
Yes, it was according to some people, it was handed over by Serbian authorities to him, and he shots in the spot the Archduke and his wife, and with that is where all this madness, we can say, starts.
Yeah, as some people call it, the shot heard around the world.
Hmm.
And well, of
He was a
course,
young he was young when he did that. He was like
18, 19
18,
years old.
19, yeah, 18 years old. Um, it's it,
Also,
it's it's interesting that that reminds me of a quote I heard in a game, that it doesn't take the most powerful nations on earth to create the next global conflict, just the will of a single man. And this man, he's basically basically what he did. I mean, I think he thought to himself, well, I soon the Serbians will could join. We are free from Austro-Hungarian oppression. But I think that because he died in on the April 28th, 1918, I think that when he was in jail, I think he was thinking what I have done. Although I think that he didn't receive much information about what was happening outside of his cell.
yeah, and well, also this event triggers what is called the the July crisis in of 1914, which basically goes this way: Austro-Hungary gives an ultimatum to Serbia to get some compensation for the assassination of the uh, crown prince of the empire.
Also, they must accept the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Police to go investigate in Serbia
Yeah,
in order to clarify the reasons of murder. And then the Serbians said no. Why? Well, first of all, because they officially say that they have nothing to do with the actions of these terrorists. Although, according to some sources, I've heard that the weapons that the Black Hand, the terrorist organization that Gavrilo Princip come from, actually handed them handguns.
yeah,
And the other was that they were not going to allow the Austro-Hungarian police in Serbian territory as if they were like a province of the empire. They were an independent nation. And then the Austro-Hungarians said, okay, we're going in. Screw
Yeah,
your optics, I'm going in.
and the Russians having Serbia as its only satellite uh, i- or its only proxy in the region, said if you attack him, I will defend him. And Germany tells them, if you attack my ally, I will defend my ally. Then France tells Germany, if you attack the ally of my ally, I will you
Hmm.
will have to face
So
me
it
again.
was it was it was basically that, and this is interesting. This is something that actually helps understand why the war got so big, because before the war, I think this came about like during the yes, what came about like in the 1800s. I mean, after the war between the Prussians and the French, was the fact that everyone was making secret alliances with each other because, of course, they knew something was going on. So Prussia, so the so the German Empire allied with the Austro-Hungarians, then with the Ottomans, the British allied with the French, and then they allied with the Russians. So everyone had alliances, and every one of them said, okay, if they attack one of us, then we will respond, and that's like this domino effect. So one nation declares the war on another, then it goes to another. And even though the French weren't even allied with the Serbians, there was no like alliance made between them. It was because the fact that the British wanted to declare war on the Germans, because the
Yeah,
Germans then declared war on the Russians.
yeah, and they the alleged cause of the British declaring war on the Germans were that the violation of the neutrality of Belgium. That I think it's important to mention this because at the start of the war, well, before the war, the Germans have this plan, the Cliffin plan.
Schlieffen
Yeah,
plan.
the
Yes, I know.
Schlieffen,
The Scheifelen man, yeah.
which was basically, go through Belgium and go around the main forces of the French and take Paris right away and get done with it.
In fact,
But
there was actually an old plan, the Schlieffen plan.
yeah,
It was planned in 1905 to 1906, and you have and it's like 10 years before the war started, because, as I told you, everyone back then knew something is going on. Something will happen. There was going to be an idiot who will start the next global conflict, and we have to be prepared for it. And I remember the reason why they chose Belgium is because Belgium is flat. It's a plain with nothing else on it. There's no hills. There's no major rivers.
Well,
There's nothing.
the main thing is that the French anticipated that they would just go through France. You see, that is the real reason. But I mean, the Schieffelin plan is all about surprise and speed. Belgium and that, being the way they are is good, but then you have to get through the Netherlands, which has a lot of dikes and as in, like, river holdings and that. So I mean, they can flood these things and slow them down.
yeah,
But you see, the Sheepland plan calls for a rapid advance, and then they could turn around and fight what they considered to be the major threat, which was Russia, because the Germans did like von Schlieffen already planned out that he didn't want a war on two fronts. It was not feasible, as we have seen many times.
Mhm.
So the plan was to go into France, beat the French, rush away really quickly, and then focus on the Russians. The
yes.
Sheepland plan did not anticipate British participation
Neither it anticipated the sudden entry of the Americans in the war later in the
or the
war.
Italians.
No.
Also, the French had this other plan, Plan
Yeah.
19,
Yep.
which was basically the invasion of Alsace-Lorraine to recover the lost territory in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. And well, at the start,
Sorry.
it went bad because, I mean, the French and the the French and the Germans, yes, they did clash in Alsace-Lorraine. Well, in that time, Elsass-Lothringen,
Mhm.
and in battles like Mulhausen, but they were the, the Germans push the French back because the army the French first fielded in the at the start of the war look really similar to that fielded by Napoleon III in the Franco-Prussian War, and also the Germans had by that time had a lot of machine guns, and
Yes, and Skoda cannons made in Czechoslovakia.
yeah, and those Skoda cannons could one impact well placed could kill around 200 soldiers.
Hmm. I mean, in that moment, I think that when the first machine gun fire was heard, I think that everyone was saying, I think that by that point, it was like a point of no return. This is not going to be your typical war of infantry advances. No, this is, and this is something also important about this war. Both sides knew this war is going to be won by the side who kills the most people, not by the side who captures the most cities or captures most territories. No, the one who kills more people is going to win. It was nihilistic to say it, but it was the way. I mean, how do you say why they brought gas later in the war,
Yeah,
or zeppelins, or any kind of the new improvements they made in warfare? Because they knew we have to kill as much as we can of them as possible. That's the only way we're going to win. And this is something that many people refer to as the suicide of Europe. And I think this is the more appropriate term to refer to this war.
Now, we've got to quickly look at
just like let
some of the
me.
general. Sorry.
I would like to mention something that happened at the start of the Schlieffen Plan when the Germans invade Belgium. They they steamroll the Belgian army almost to the
Of course.
and but the Kaiser gave instructions that the army the army was not to touch the castle where the princess uh, Carlota lived. Why? Because she was the sister-in-law of his ally, Franz Joseph. I mean, if you think it was one of the first operations of Mexico in the war.
Oh, Mexico. What did they do? They went out in the trenches selling oranges.
No, I mean the Empress of Mexico was her house was not to be touched by the German army that was using all the was not to be touched by the army. So in deference to his ally, but yeah, going on to the generals, Ernest.
I mean, yeah, you had one major one early on, and that was someone who gets a little bit of hissing here, at least in Newfoundland. Douglas Haig, um, also known as the Butcher of the Somme, because he threw away, so many people in meaningless trench warfare. And the thing is that he wasn't actually that good a general. Um, he had lost field exercises, I believe, in 1913, um, to someone with a much smaller army during the training. I'm just trying to find it
Also,
here. Mm-hmm.
around that time, some other generals in this French side were Ferdinand Foch, Father
Yep.
Vic, that he said airplanes were interesting toys with no military value.
But at this moment, it sounds excessively funny. And then you realize, oh no, planes actually, in some cases, won the war.
Yeah, and of course you have Philippe Pétain, the Lion of Verdun, Um,
Yeah.
this and also just like a side note, Petain at the start of the Third Reich and the invasion of France, he was really sympathetic to Hitler.
Yes,
He also was friend of Francisco Franco in his time of ambassador of France in Spain.
es mi cuate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Um,
so yeah, and
but
well, yep.
I'm sorry. Speaking of you
Thomas Haig.
know, no, of Haig and Falk, who said that airplanes are interesting toys. This is actually what I was seeing here because Haig was actually gendering GOC of Aldershot in 1912, and in the Army maneuvers of 1912, I said it was 13. I'm sorry. He was actually beaten pretty badly by Sir James Grierson because Grierson used air reconnaissance. Um,
There you got your toy.
and no, and it was, and I mean, it's funny that they left him in charge, despite the fact that he literally got crushed by Grierson, who then died in 1914.
Also, in the other side of this front, you I mean, I think he was an impressive soldier, career officer, but I think he was way too defensive for the purposes of the Skiflin plan. And Ruprecht of Bavaria, the crown
Oh,
prince
yeah.
of Bavaria.
You know, many German generals come from Bavaria. Actually, it's kind of strange. I mean, that's the place that produces most German commanders.
Yeah, and I mean, he was a brilliant commander. I mean, he was one of the architects of the Hindenburg line, and the on the tactics of the defense in depth, of receiving all the enemies you can into your territory, and when they are overstretched, counterattack.
Yeah,
Mhm.
elastic defense or defense in depth.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You know, that's
And
actually a sad thing about the Germans. They have in both wars, they had great commanders, they have the best equipment you can have, but then the problem about the Germans, and I think that it also happened in World War One, is that they cannot adapt when their plan doesn't go as they intended to do. For example, the Schieffelin plan. Once the Schieffelin plan didn't work, they didn't know what to do. They just stuck there in the trenches for years
well, they got
because they
bogged
didn't.
down, and that's the
Yeah.
problem. Like the plan was supposed to be about speed, and it goes completely the opposite. I mean, because they didn't anticipate trench warfare because trench warfare was not so common back then. I mean, everything was artillery, or it was a dash of valor. You
There's like
mounted your cavalry.
besides trenches, up to that point, were mostly used in sieges. In
Yeah,
fact, the whole idea of thinking about a trench back then was, for example, the only thing I believe that people read about were the trenches that the Ottomans built to surround the city of Vienna, I think during the 1453. Or even when Caesar, I mean, we're talking about Roman times, encircled Vercingetorix in the city of Alesia. He built actually huge moats and wooden forts to keep him away of his
Well,
relief armies.
yeah, well,
So
there was that, and a starve out. It starved out the people and kept the reinforcements from coming in. But
yeah,
I mean, we also can't. But I mean, the trench warfare created the innovations which, ironically, broke the stalemate of World War One, but then enabled the tactics that came about that enabled Germany to flourish again in World War Two.
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it will be interesting to to mention how they came to that stalemate in World War One. I mean,
Tell us,
at,
Eduardo.
at first, the French invade Alsace-Lorraine, the Germans invade Belgium. So the Germans repel the French in Alsace-Lorraine in what is called the Battle of the Plan 19 and the Battle of the Border of the Front of the Battle of the Frontiers. And the Germans also invade almost all the whole country of Belgium. And when they were storming into France, and the first and the Battle of the Marne began. I mean, you know what happened there. It's an interesting story. Uh, a lot of cab drivers, bus drivers, and
Yeah.
almost anyone with a vehicle in Paris took soldiers to the front lines to stop the Germans on their tracks. And there and also in the Battle of Ypres, almost at the same time, the Indian contingent of the British Army stopped also the Germans. So at that moment, they dig in and waited for the moment to counterattack, and they
Yeah.
be, and there it began what was called the race to the sea, where they start digging trenches all the way to the English Channel to the north and all the way to Switzerland to the south. And for the next year, it was a big stalemate until uh, the Germans came with a plan to break the stalemate.
That was
Which
the first battle of the Marne.
Yeah, the
no,
miracle of the no
Oh,
no
some.
no, no. I was going to tell you Verdun.
Verdun.
Oh,
I was just thinking there, like, well, I thought Pablo meant the miracle of the Marne in 14.
Yeah, which was the all the people with cars in from Paris
yeah.
taking soldiers to the front.
That would actually. That I hope that in the future we see a film that actually portrays that. It will be like some kind of like a Dunkirk film,
Oh
like a
yeah,
Dunkirk S film, because just like a passing note, we haven't had up to this point good movies about World War One. There are very few. I mean, I can mention like um, All Quiet on the Western Front, but as far as
totally
films
recommend.
go, yes, totally recommendable. But as far as I can tell, just the only one I know. There's no other like major film about the war. I'm,
And there's a series called The Passing Bells, which is about how the start of the war and the Battle of the Somme, how the
Mhm.
triumphalist the triumphalist way that the British and the Germans marched to war and and fought there.
Mhm.
But mm, uh, and at the end of the day, it was bad for both of them.
Mhm.
It's true. But
Uh,
moving forward there, so we can kind of keep everything
just
in the. Yep. Go ahead. Sorry.
to mention about Verdun, which was basically the plan of the Germans to uh, break through the lines of the French in the site of the city of Verdun, because it was some the city was of some significance for the French. So breaking through there also would represent like a really clear advance to Paris and and the end of the war.
Mhm.
But it kept it was it at the start. Yes, the Germans started to advance and taking forts on the French positions, but finally they were stopped and pushed back, and in this case by General Philippe Pétain. He
Mm.
was the one in charge of the defense of Verdun.
You have to think about the magnitude we're talking about. This was the largest battle and the longest of the war, from the 21st of February to the 18th of December of 1916. 9 months, 3 weeks, and 6 days.
Yeah,
If I
and
remember about this war, is about this battle, is that the Germans hoped that the French will overcommit their forces, and I think the best way to explain it was like a meat grinder.
mhm.
That the Germans would just stay there and rain them with everything they got to the French, trying to recapture the towns.
Yeah.
And yes, I think, but to this point, it was because the Germans had brought new divisions from the Eastern Front because the Russians were out of the war.
Almost out of the war, and of course they had this. It was the battle in which the Germans fired the most artillery in all the war.
I think I've read things about that. It's like let me see if I can find it. But keep talking. I will find that number.
Uh, on but then one of the reactions of the British in for that battle was uh, that the battle that was going to be the magna opus of our friend Sir Douglas Haig. Ernest, what can you tell us of the Battle of the Somme?
Well, it was a complete slaughter and a waste of time, to be honest. But it did show the bravery of my own Dominion's forces at the Battle of Beaumont Hamel. Unfortunately, we didn't get any farther than something called the Danger Tree. So we sent our military, which was one regiment, and said, "Go to your checkpoint is the tree. Go to the tree and then go forward from there." And we did not get that far. We got wiped out. It was a slaughter, and um it actually destroyed part of it. That battle was one of the main reasons that Newfoundland lost its independence, actually, and I will discuss that later on. But I'm just trying to see here, because now this is something they tell us all the time in school, and this is the biggest thing that we have to learn is the sacrifice of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. Um, about 780 soldiers went forward into that battle, and 110 came back. And after that, only 68 were available the next day. And you see, you have to understand, for these guys, this was the flower of Newfoundland's, society. These were the young men. We only had like a 250,000 people in Newfoundland at the time. We were not that big a country. We were, despite our geographic size, and we're still not that big population wise, but it wiped us out. And we're not talking about, the fishermen or their sons or anything like that, because while that wiped them out, a lot of the officers, well, actually, I think 90% of the officers were the merchant class. And they represented, the ruling establishment of Newfoundland, the educated people, the guys whose fathers owned, the great East Coast merchant families that controlled, every aspect of Newfoundland society, from mining to fishing to hunting, everything.
Yeah.
And you wipe out, say if a merchant only has one son and that son died, that business is gone. The merchant has no one to pass it on to. And so he sells off and dissolves and goes off quietly. And
that's the kind of, like, we can use it as an example, broader context with not only the small nation but the bigger nation in the conflict, the Germans, the British. How many families were destroyed by this war? How many boys grew up without a father? How many kids went to this battle and had to be buried by their elder parents?
Well, they weren't generally buried. They were shoved in a cemetery with an unknown grave, and then.
Oh yeah, my bad.
but I mean, like, there was one story I read about earlier, and one man's death destroyed a village in Newfoundland because it was the son of one of the merchants, and he owned the fish plant, the cannery, everything like that. And then when his son was killed and they couldn't even find the body, the father just said, "I'm done. I quit. I give up on everything." And the village dissolved into nothing because the people all relied on that one merchant family. So and he went to, I believe, England. So a lot of capital flight came because of the war, and also the great expense, because Newfoundland really shouldn't have been involved in this war. We didn't have the manpower. We didn't
you're saying that you sent 780 guys to the
and
war.
most of them got killed.
Most of them got killed. And
Altogether, we sent like 6,000 people. Altogether, like 6,000 Newfoundlanders participated in the Second World War, in the First World War, I believe.
And also, you said that prior to serving in the Western Front, they also served in the campaign of Gallipoli, right?
They did. They
oh my god, that of all the battles of World War One, that actually is like the stupidest one I can think about.
But we didn't really get butchered in that one. Which was good. We lost.
The Australians got butchered. That's good.
Yeah, but none of it was really good. But I mean, over 3 months, 30 soldiers from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment were killed, which, if you're looking at statistics, is a rather good number.
Yeah.
The 150 were treated by frostbite, and 10 died of disease, which was rare. But they were the last of the British Dardanelles Army, one of the last troops to leave in 1916 from Gallipoli. So they then did that, and then decided, let's send the Newfies to the Somme. They'll handle that. And I actually said here a quote from one of the major generals, Bouvard de Lys. He says about the Newfoundland Regiment, it was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed because of success because dead men can advance no further.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard that. You told me that.
So, and even this, I'll tell you this, we still feel this battle today. I mean, this is the battle that everybody talks about because it was our trial by fire. And we suffered for it. And because of that, July 1st is not just Canada Day, it's Memorial Day, because that's when the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel started, July 1st. So we celebrate as a Dominion, or we did. July 1st is Memorial Day, secondary to Canada Day. Now, the Canadians don't really like that, but up them.
Mm-hmm.
But going forward, that was our participation in the war.
I want to add to the Verdun battle, which the objective of the battle actually was to, unburden, take a some of the burden of the Verdun sector of the trench line, and also in the Battle of the Somme, there was a young lieutenant who later will become famous because of his writings on the Lord of the Rings.
Oh yes. Tolkien took part in that battle.
Yeah, J.R.R. Tolkien.
In fact, I am the depiction of war in there's actually one place, the swamps. What were the name? The marshes, the ghost marshes, the ones who are outside of Mordor, in which they are like the decomposing bodies of elves, orcs, and men that Frodo and Sam have to cross to get to Mordor. That's actually comes out of the image that Tolkien had of the battlefield of Verdun, because you have to know that, and this is something that every time we see in movies and depictions of the war, these guys were fighting on basically a wasteland, and in some cases when it rained, it was a swamp. And sometimes I've read the Germans and even the French, they sway the course of rivers, and basically the place you're fighting in is completely muddied, and you see the bodies of your countrymen floating because there's no one there to take them and give them proper burial. Have rats, you have you have the toxic gases. I mean, it's a pretty it was hell on earth. And if you want, I mean, and that the death marches is the closest thing, is how Tolkien envisioned that eerie sight.
But by the way, speaking of gases, interesting fact, the gas mask was invented by a Newfoundlander.
Really?
Yeah. We invented the gas mask. We
Nice.
yeah. Well, it was kind of a necessary thing because back then most people used to pee on a cloth
Yeah.
and hold it up to their nose in order to keep the gases from killing them.
Yeah,
And
I've been reading about it to know if it is true, and yes, in some parts it was true. Now, the first gas masks were actually seen British models. They were just like a flannel with
they,
two eye holes and glass and a little hose to breathe. And then the Germans come and they create they have more newer ones that actually look like modern gas masks. But it was like but it was of course necessary. I mean, and even horses have had gas masks. Let's remember that in this war, cavalry was still important. Not as important as the war progressed, but it was still key to as and in some areas as the most parts the baggage train was mostly used mostly brought by horses instead of vehicles. I mean, this is a time in which vehicles like trucks are not yet widely used.
Yeah. And of course,
but
there's
sorry, can I just finish up about the gas mask? Because I mean that is
yeah,
that is a really important technological advantage.
It is.
Um, it was invented by Clooney McPherson from St. John's because everything is comes out of St. John's. But yeah, he invented the gas mask, and he also survived the war up until 1966. And he was the medical officer for the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, which became the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And so he created the chemical absorbing fabric in that, and it caught on. So Newfoundland saved the day.
Yep.
yeah.
But actually, the problem with the gas was that a lot of the people who generally died first were the colonial troops when they first employed it because they didn't actually realize what it was. Nobody really did until the gas crept through and killed them.
Yeah, but really most colonial. But there's this picture there's a very famous about I think it's from the Battle of the Somme that shows two machine gunners wearing the gas masks, and I'm started thinking about it. How you would be the sight of men wearing these masks in the battlefield? You were thinking, what are these ghosts?
In fact, I always have this feeling from these sorry these images in black and white of soldiers in gas masks and in the trenches from World War I as one of the most apocalyptic visions for myself. I mean, it's if I imagine it as maybe Otto Dix, a German soldier and a later painter. Imagine it. I
Yes.
mean, his
Oh,
paints.
it's terrifying.
Yeah, his paints
Yeah.
about the war, are terrifying and gut wrenching because this. And I think it's one of from graphical representations of this war. This is one of the most that one that actually captures a lot of the suffering and wickedness and turmoil from the war.
Europe was basically killing each other. I mean, this is the reason why it's different. And I'm sharing my screen. I think it's this painting you're referring to.
Yeah.
Yes, the advance of stormtroopers under gas. That is when I was younger, that picture terrified me, and it still does.
I mean, it is because, I mean, you have to put in the perspective of actually a soldier in the trenches of the First World War, and this is something that by that time, let's imagine. I mean, people were accustomed to this type of war. As I said, and when we were talking about it in the beginning, gleaming uniforms and cavalry charges and and heroes on both sides. No, this is a war where there are no heroes. This is a war in which the aim is to just the aim to kill. There's no glory on this battlefield. There's nothing. There's
Just
just
as Bolognese.
No,
yes,
no glory to be won.
no glory to be won. There was nothing.
Well, same with Gettysburg. I mean, Gettysburg is kind of like the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, I should say, was kind of a precursor to what this kind of conflicts are going to be. You know, a meaningless slaughter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's kind of different when we talk about, for example, the Second World War, because in the Second World War, people already lived the First World War, and everyone knew that everyone didn't want to repeat the thing and that. And I think that's the reason why when besides because the Second World War, the reason why it was the bloodiest conflict in human history was mostly because of civilian deaths, mostly of indiscriminate bombing, and if we add like the 3, I think, or 6 million people who died on the Holocaust, um, who were not all Jews. We have to talk about the Slavs, the Romani, the gays, everyone who the Nazis deemed inferior. But turning to the point, is the fact that when you start seeing these images, and personally for me, I remember that most times I've had nightmares of this type of battlefield, that like this wasteland of there's just clouds of gas and men fighting in gas masks, and the fact that this is, and then I woke up and start thinking this is not a dream that actually happened.
yeah, it's the image of soldiers, going over the top into a cloud of smoke or gas willingly, and then not coming back, and maybe their bodies torn to pieces by the artillery. It's one of the most terrific things I can imagine for
Mhm.
someone in there.
And you remember you said about the amount of artillery. So here it says that of the 800,000 casualties of Verdun, an estimated 70% was caused by artillery.
Yes.
The Germans launched 2 million shells during their opening bombardment, more than any engagement in history until that point. And the two sides fired between 40 and 60 million shells over the next 10 months. The rumbles from the barrages were heard as far as 100 miles away, and soldiers described certain hills as being so heavily bombed that they gushed fired like volcanoes. Those lucky enough to survive were often left with severe shell shock from the constant drum roll of falling bombs. This I arrived there with 175 men, wrote one Frenchman whose unit fell victim to a German artillery attack at Verdun. I left with 34, several half mad, not replying anymore when I spoke to them.
Yeah, it's mm, well, it's a difficult thing here for them. All the, I mean, 40% of the casualties of the Somme were cases of PTSD or shell shock.
Yeah.
But another comment of Verdun: all the artillery barrages that were fired there prompted the men in the trenches to call that sector the Devil's Anvil. So imagine that all the German artillery hammering on the French lines. It's uh, it's
No, it's also that I hope that we never have to see that kind of conflict ever again. I wish that we, because I mean, I hope that we can still read about these things, and there is never never we see such a bloody thing happening ever again.
yeah. And well, I would like to direct our attention to another important front of the war, the Eastern Front. How
Yes.
Yes.
how the oh, how the well which was one of the first major, well, one of the first major power to actually declare war to another major power was Russia to Austria-Hungary, and they had their plan was basically invade um, Germany, thinking that they will be too busy on the Western Front, which at the start, yes, they were busy, but uh, they brought a general, an important general on on 1914, Paul von Hindenburg.
Oh
Yeah,
yes, we all
and
know that.
I want to get to that point because he's attributed as the victor of the Battle of Tannenberg, one of the greatest milestones for the Germans in the war, and of course the Masurian Lake, the battles of the Masurian Lakes, which prompted the Russians to run away from East Prussia. But tell us, Ernest, about the Battle of Tannenberg and
The,
von Hindenburg.
well, the thing about Tannenberg is that Hindenburg got all the credit, but he wasn't apparent. Like according to what I've studied in that, is that he was not the architect. The architect was someone named Max Hoffman, who was the staff officer for Hindenburg. And when Hindenburg got all the credit, Hoffman was really not pleased with this. And when he did manage, when once the war was over, he used to take cadets out to Tannenberg and would point out. He'd be like, "Well, listen, this is where von Hindenburg slept before the battle. This is where he slept during the battle, and this is where he woke up after the battle." Um, and he was actually the main mastermind behind it.
Well, also, just to mention this, um, Max Hoffman was awarded the Iron Cross First Class and the
The
ma-
Blue Max.
and the medal the pour le mérite, the major the major award, military award in the Prussian army that carried on the German Empire. Yeah, the Blue Max, as
And he
is.
actually negotiated with Russia to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So he was actually an incredibly brilliant man. He's actually considered to be one of Germany's best staff officers.
Yeah, and he's almost an unsung hero of the war.
Mm-hmm.
No, well, he is. I mean, because who really knows about Max Hoffman? You only know about Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff.
And a little less about Ruprecht of Bavaria or
Leto von Borbeck. Von
yeah,
Borbeck.
von Borbeck, August von Mackensen.
August von Mackensen is one of my favorites
Yeah,
because he was a man of honor, but
nice.
he was also a bit brutal. But he was also, I mean, he was a brilliant general.
Yeah,
Um,
and he got a nice taste on hats.
he did, and
Yes.
his son actually fought in World War II,
Yep.
Oh.
Well,
but was also a war criminal.
oh,
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Well, also the Russians, while invading East Prussia, also invaded Galicia, the in the frontier they shared with Austria-Hungary,
Uh-huh.
which is strange. I don't know why. Is the why the Russians didn't attempt at first an invasion through Poland, which was like an open flank for the Germans. It was actually the Germans that pressed over there, but were stopped in the Battle of Vistula River. But and well, apparently the Russians won a big victory there. And by this, I want to mention, well, to uh, uh, finish or take on a myth of the war that the Russians were the most incompetent army out there. Yes, their empire was crumbling. Yes, their troops were ill equipped and ill trained, but they managed to do some of the greatest, um, the greatest offensives of the war. it was some, and we will reach to them later. This was a big failure, the aftermath of the Battle of Vistula River, because the Russians didn't press their advantage in that point. And well, and just to link what was happening in the Western Front to what was going on in the Eastern Front, I would like you to mention something about the, well, not only that, also mentioning Tannenberg. It was such a big failure for the Russians. Yes, that was a failure,
Yes.
but because
Also, it kind of like destroyed
the Second Army, yeah,
Sorry.
and not only that, they when they destroyed that second Russian army, they killed the commander of the army.
Well, no, he shot himself in the head.
Yeah, well,
At Tannenberg.
Whoa.
yeah, he was
Wait,
trapped, I
but
think.
if someone tells you to shoot yourself in the head and then you do it, does that still count as suicide?
Yes,
Well, at the end of the day, well,
it worked for Rommel.
yeah.
Oh yeah,
Well, also the well, after this initial, stalemate, the the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians pushed in what was called the offensive of Gorlice-Tornov, which prompted what the Russians called the Great Retreat. But uh, uh, it the moment came when the allies of Russia were in dire need of some relief in the Verdun sector, and they asked Russia to start an offensive to to relieve them. And so the General Brusilov attacked the Brusilov offensive, which was the the most successful offensive of the war, and one of the way and the moment when the tactics of stormtroopers came to be in the war. Uh, Squads of soldiers armed with short arms and grenades going through the no man's land, while the artillery, the Russian, their own artillery was still firing on the German and Austrian positions, and well, they actually managed it. Also, this offensive is called the Brusilov offensive, but he was in charge only in the south sector of the southern sector of the Eastern Front. So, in case of being they were relying on the Russians pressing pressing the Germans on their sector, which they failed miserably again. They couldn't even enter Germany, and well, this Brusilov offensive steamrolled the Austrians all the way to the Carpathians, which are the mountains, a mountain range in Romania. At this moment, Romania, seeing that Austro-Hungary was weakened, and one of the present-day part of Romania, including the capital Bucharest, belonged to the no Bucharest didn't. Bucharest, not, it wasn't part of the empire, but almost half of the present-day territory of Romania was part of the Austrian Empire back then, and they wanted to recover what they perceive as their land. So they start pressing them too. And well, the Brusilov offensive in that regard actually was a success, because the Germans have to retreat some units from the Western Front to take them to the Eastern Front to save the Austrians. And in that offensive, you could say that basically the Austrians were
well done, Russia. You actually did something.
Yeah, they were beaten by then, and their military capacity, their fighting capacity was done and dusted.
That's what all they could do.
Yeah, and well, here we are now in 1916. The trench warfare in the Western Front, the Russians pressing on the Austrians, but there is another major event there that also affected the course of the war, which was the death of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph.
Yes, that
The end.
actually
Yeah,
that leave the Austro-Hungarian Empire basically without leadership in such a dire time. And
yeah, and
he was an old emperor.
yeah, and
He had ruled like 63 years.
yeah, he ascended to the throne when he was 18 years old and died there. And well, he was the rallying figure of the Austrian Empire. He because he actually formed the empire as it was.
Yeah, he formed it, and then he watched it. Then he died, and it crumbled.
Yeah.
Which shows you the force of will of Franz Joseph II.
Yeah,
Yep.
and also, well, I will. We should talk. What do you say about the other fronts of the war in the Middle East, Gallipoli,
Oh, Gallipoli is one of my
Italy,
Gallipoli
the
is one of my
Pacific,
favorite. Is
or
one of my
Africa?
favorites.
Tell us about Gallipoli, Pablo.
Okay, so the Battle of Gallipoli, and this is interesting. It's one of my favorite campaigns to study as as I do because I'm a history buff. But the thing that I like to read about is that the sheer lack of the British. They say, oh, I mean, the Turks are just a bunch of Arabs with rifles. They're not going to do nothing. They thought that they could easily march on Istanbul because by this point this was like 1915. The British knew that to beat the Germans they needed to encircle them, and the only way to do that was defeating the Turks. So I think it was
Churchill.
Churchill. Yes, Churchill, who wasn't yet prime minister.
No, he was First Lord of the Admiralty.
First Lord of the Admiralty, he devised a plan in which they could give support to the Russians and also take out one of the major powers. The idea was to sail across the Mediterranean, arrive at the Aegean Sea, and conquered the sector of land called the Dardanelles or the Dardanelos. It was like a territory that will give you easy access to Istanbul, or many people call them in those times Constantinople. The biggest problem with this campaign was, first of all, the lack of preparation from the British side. I mean, they brought forces from Australia, India, Newfoundland, New Zealand, and they thought they could just easily win, considering that the territory was. They say, we're going to get there. Problem was that the Turks, in this point, they were trained by German officers, and in some cases led by German officers, and they knew how to beat. He knew how to beat them. So,
also, as an interesting note, the maps that were used to plan this invasion dated back from the war or the Crimea War in the 1850s.
Yeah, a lot of things had changed, but a lot of things had changed by that time period. Also, the fact that the British misjudged the Turks. I mean, they didn't thought they would put up much of a fight. But what the Turks did, well, the Turks they dug in, they built machine gun nests, they fortified several towns, and they brought with them German-made artillery as well as Skoda cannons, and they held wave after wave of what the Anzac brought them, because in this battle was mostly fought by Anzac troops. The Anzac were Australian and New Zealanders, and in fact there was like a bit of there were problems between the chain of command because most commanders were British and the soldiers were Australians, and the British didn't like at all Australians. It wasn't like I will say something that actually jeopardized the entire operation, but it was something that it wasn't very helpful. That your own officers do not trust your own judgment. I mean, you're led by officers who would rather prefer to be anywhere else.
Yeah, and I would like to add that one of the best commanders of the British Empire was the Australian John Monash, in my own
Mhm.
opinion.
Oh,
Arthur Curry was also a very, very good general, and he was Canadian.
no one cares
Yeah.
about Canadians.
Well, no, he perfected the creeping barrage.
The one that is shooting shooting in a position and then a little far back, far back, far back.
Yep, and then the infantry advances behind it as a shield.
Yeah.
So as far as I know about the battle was that at first the British managed to held a beachhead, but when they started advancing to the neighboring coastal towns, they got
Achibaba.
yes, they got wrecked by by the Ottoman Turks' combined arms fire. They got beaten by the machine guns and the artillery, and by 1916, by I think it was like the beginning of January, there was no position that could be held. There was nothing. The Turks were right there, and there was nowhere to advance. And this battle actually costed. First of all, it costed the Churchill's position as Lord of the. It was Lord of the Admiralty. Was that?
Yeah.
And
Also, I think there were like 40,000 ANZAC casualties.
it's here. I found the casualties. So in total, well, I think that the most important are the dead. So the Ottoman Turks, they lost. The casualties were 164,828, 56,000 dead, 97,000 wounded, and 11,000 missing. But count that with and the British lost 34,000 men, 78,000 wounded, and 7,000 missing. A total of 120,000 casualties. The Australians were in total. Okay, so the Allies in total, British, New Zealanders, and Australians, 56,000 dead, 123,000 wounded, 7,000 missing. So for a total of 187,959 dead.
And of course, there's this Sabaton song about Gallipoli. It's called The Cliffs of Gallipoli. I mean, I recommend you Sabaton a lot. They have some songs, many songs about this war, in particular, Cliffs of Gallipoli. And when the others came, to when this when the occasion presents itself, I will mention the other songs. But this one, Gallipoli, it was interesting.
Also, the interesting is the fact that this battle was so badly planned. I mean, yes, the idea was sound, and everyone wanted to just end the war just now. But the problem was they didn't have the preparation. They didn't, as you said, they didn't have the accurate maps of the place they're meant to invade. How do you expect that these soldiers are going to carry out their orders if they're not giving accurate information about the places they're fighting? Besides the fact that the Turks were perfectly capable of fighting on their own turf with German equipment, and that is the thing that the British thought, no, the Turks are not going to put up much of a fight. They're just, I mean, we said, they were the sick man of Europe. There's nothing they can do that can hurt us. And no, they beat them fair and square.
Yeah, and well, some other fronts that saw a lot of action, and well, so the Flipman, a friend from our Discord server, we sent hello to him. He actually asked us about one of the African campaigns in the war. The African campaigns actually centered around the German colonies.
Yes,
Togoland, uh,
Togoland, Cameroon.
yeah, Togoland fell fairly quickly. The next to fall was the one that actually Flipman asked us about, West Africa, German West Africa, or present day Namibia. Mm, well, it's important to mention this. The two biggest two colonies of Germany shared a border with Portuguese colonies, so they actually, even in time of peace, had a lot of skirmishes with the Portuguese army. That was one that prompted the entrance of the War of Portugal to and well, and in this case also there was this, and we were talking also about the Boer Wars,
Mm-hmm.
and well, um, the German colonies were ill-equipped and on
Mostly native
yeah,
African troops.
Askari troops, Schutztruppe,
Mm-hmm.
and well, undermanned. I mean, they have not much soldiers, but they have, well, in this case, what they did what they could, and in the case of Namibia, they fomented a Boer insurrection, the Maritz Rebellion, and actually, well, kept the South Africans busy right in their corner of the world.
Yeah.
But
I
at
mean,
the
it's
end, it
like
folded by 1950. By half of the year, by May 1915, the Namibia campaign was over. Then Cameroon campaign was over by 1916. But I think the most important, and I think one, I think we have been singing the praises for this German general in the war in this episode, fairly, and because I think he deserves it. Paul von Lithog-Borbeck
Oh
yes,
yeah, no, I think he
in
was the
East
best.
Africa. Yeah,
he was
he
a
wa-
badass.
and he was
He deserves a film.
yeah, he was undefeated in the field also.
Also, he fought. His force. I mean, he fought. Here it says that for 4 years in Germany, East Africa, he held with 40,000 men. There were 3,000 Germans, 11,000 Africans. He held out 300,000 British, Belgian, and Portuguese troops.
Yeah,
He says that according to American writer that specializes in military history, Edwin Palmer Hoyt, as the greatest single guerrilla operation in history and the most successful. And for his exploits, he received the nickname the Loebon Africa, the Lion of Africa.
yeah, and I think he's well deserved. I mean, some people criticize him as being more like a not much of a tactician, but a leader. He knew how to take care of command.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, credit where is due. He really did his part, because the instruction that the German colonies actually received from the motherland was to declare neutrality and do not intervene in the war. But General von Lithog-Borbeck, as a well, professional military, he understood that his duty to the German Empire was to keep their enemies busy, so they couldn't send more troops to the Western Front in this case. And I think he really achieved that objective.
Mm-hmm. He as this is something that we usually lose when we talk about military history. The fact that soldiers follow orders, and he thought that the best course of action was to hold out, and he did. In fact, you have to think that he fought. Most of his army was made of Africans, and he says that he was fluent in Swahili, which was the language of his soldiers. So, of course, we're talking about a guy who knew his men. He knew that the way to win what was I mean that's something that I that was that's why I like this guy is the fact that not just sorry, he did not just only lead his soldiers, he knew his soldiers, he knew how to beat the British because of course he told his fellow Africans he knew that they know how to use the jungle, the rivers, how to beat the British at their own game.
Yeah, and also he was well, he became afterward he was, I think, involved in politics.
Mhm.
He was on a monarchist faction and opposed, and he was really opposed to Hitler.
Yes, he
And
was distrusted of Hitler and his movement.
yeah, and he was bueno, so, after the war, many years after the war, when he died, the West Germany actually passed the West German Assembly
Mhm.
passed a law to give war remunerations, or their due salaries to the Askari Schutztruppe from
Mhm.
Yeah,
the
but a lot of them, I'm sorry, there. Yeah, a lot of them didn't have the
papers.
paperwork. But somebody said perform the manual at arms, and the people who claimed to be veterans could do it perfectly, even
Yeah,
after all those years.
yeah, like I mean, they were handed a broom, and the German manual of arms, and they passed with flying colors. So and when he died, also some of the people that fought with him in Tanzania, well, East Africa, went to his funeral in Germany.
It will have been cool in Battlefield One there was a campaign just about him of von Borbeck,
Yeah,
but sadly we didn't get that. What we got instead were instead that supposedly all German snipers were Ascari.
yeah. Well,
I, I
well,
say
going.
this to everyone who's watching. Don't take Battlefield One's depiction of World War One seriously. More because the fact that most armies feel too many people of color. For example, the British have there's the medic is an Indian. Well, they fought, of course, but they weren't that many.
They were a million, not only on the Western Front.
Well, they were the second largest contributor in terms of like the British
Yeah,
contingent.
so I think I mean, if there are people of color in Battlefield One, is because there were fighting in that side. For example, the German Askari troopers, the
Although it's weird that German Ascari troopers on the Western Front seems like a kind of a stretch. I would prefer them to see them in
yeah,
German.
yeah, I know,
It
but
feels weird. Feels weird.
I mean, I think it's a way to honor those who fought, and it will be nice to have a East German campaign in there, but well,
Yeah,
sadly,
it will be. Yeah, sadly, we don't get that. Now, instead, we got Battlefield 5 that is going to give us bionic female commandos.
okay,
But yeah, anyway, guys,
Yeah, yeah.
we are getting a little off topic,
yeah,
Yeah,
and
sorry. Let's return
and
to.
yeah,
So
we only
we
have a
were.
limited amount of time, sadly to say.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I would like
So
to
we.
ask you
Mhm.
about the Pacific Front and the Far Eastern ally, Japan.
Japan, I mean, they
You know
they
that
they
that's like
contributed.
the strangest front out of all. There's very few things that we can talk about that
Yeah,
because there were not. Mhm.
mostly the Battle of Qingdao and the exploits of the East Asia Squadron that actually fought a battle in Chilean territorial waters,
Oh, yes, I think
or
I
the Battle of Coronel.
Coronel,
Yeah,
Battle of Coronel. I remember that we were in class, and every one of my classmates were like, "Ooh, wait, what the fuck?" They were Germans fighting Germans, and they thought that there was a battle in the field. No, no, no. So for those of you who don't know, and talking to the audience. It was in the 1st of November of 1914. Oh, it was right when the war was starting. There was a battle between British ships under the command of Sir Christopher Craddock and John Luce that fought against ships of the German Empire under Graf Maximilian von Spee. The British had 2 armored cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 1 auxiliary cruiser, and the Germans had 2 armored cruisers and 3 light cruisers. It was a victory for the Germans, and the reason why they were there mostly is to this point I don't know, because it was really surreal, at least for the people who live by the city of Coronel. For those of you, Coronel is a not a very large city. It's just like it has less than how many, like 107,000 inhabitants. So imagine waking up one day and seeing ships, ships just fighting there in the street, fighting there on the waters outside of your home. Um, but well, this battle was well, it was one of the many battles of the particularly the Pacific Front. Although, if I say correctly, the Pacific Front, at least in the war, at least in what it meant in the broader war, the consequences weren't as big as they were, for example, in Africa or the Middle East. The Pacific was mostly like I don't know. The very few things happened there that actually caused like repercussions outside of that area of influence. Hello?
Yeah, yeah, and well, also there was the intervention of uh, Japan was basically seizing the German colonies in all in the Pacific, and also in China, Qingdao, which basically was a German city by then, and they built it from scratch. And also because it's not strange because people, well, by that time the British and everybody knew that it was going to happen, that they were going to have to face Japan, because Japan have this doctrine about uh, expanding their influence around certain radius, all along their islands. And I think they saw it will be easier to take Qingdao from the Germans and some of their islands in that moment, and simply sit on them and let the war take its own course in Europe, because they didn't send troops there. And also the Allies were really resentful of that, because I mean they could actually send them to Mesopotamia or Africa to fight, but no, they said no, we're not sending more troops here. Their only other land activity, maybe related to the war, was the evacuation of the the Russian Czech Legion that crossed Siberia to the other side of to the Pacific, and there was actually evacuated from there to fight in the Western Front. But yeah, that was basically it in the Pacific. But what about the Middle East? What do you think about that?
I remember some guy, Lawrence of Arabia, ringing any bells?
Yeah, the Lawrence, an important. Well, it's. I mean, just to summarize really quickly, what was the actions fought there in the Middle East? The British invaded the Persian Gulf in Fao and tried to advance to Baghdad, but they were beaten in the city of Kut. Then a second army actually made it to Baghdad, The Turks invaded Sinai and went all the way to the Suez Canal, but the British pushed them back. Also, the British tried to invade Palestine. They failed miserably a couple of times.
Just a very passing thought. I remember that there was like a proclamation made by the British that if the
Oh yeah,
Hebrews help them fight against the Turks,
the
they will
Balfour
discuss
Yeah,
Declaration.
the Balfour
the
Declaration,
Balfour Declaration. They
and
will discuss the creation of a
Jewish
Jewish
state
state in
in Palestine.
Palestine,
Yeah,
and that promise alone will later cause in 1948 the first of a long series of conflicts between Israelis and Arabs.
yeah, and
That
also another important thing here, I think we were discussing this, you and I, Ernest, yesterday, the Sykes-Picot Treaty.
which essentially has caused the Middle East to be the absolute hellhole that it is.
hmm,
Yeah, which basically divided the Middle East, and for the one part for the Russians, another part for the British, another part for the French, not taking into account the ethnical groups or actual borders, if you want to say it that way.
There was like also the same in Africa, the way that nations were divided.
Exactly. And well, it was a really a sad thing. And just before, just to close with this section of the other fronts of the war, I would like to just to well two things. First, the Italian front, really quickly. I think it can be summarized in the 12 battles of on the Isonzo River, which basically was a big stalemate until the Germans broke it in the Battle of Caporetto. Erwin Rommel fought in that battle as a captain of uh, a stormtrooper unit, and got the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, for his actions there. And
Yes,
also
he did.
the Balkan fronts, which was basically, I mean, I think it was fairly successful for the Central Powers that front, because they beat everybody else, uh, and also they beat everybody else except for Greece, and they managed to surrender Romania completely. And well, and in this front, it's where um, August von Mackensen actually uh, uh, directed some troops. And I would like to talk about really quickly about the siege of Belgrade, when the Austrians uh, took the city. The one last regiment was on the other side of the river, directed by Major Dragutin Gavrilovich. They
Mm-hmm.
were they were they and the last orders they got was to to break the siege, to take all the city back. And he uh, he pronounces a speech, a brief speech to his troops to encourage them to fight. If you let me, I will read it. It said,
Mm-hmm.
"Soldiers, exactly at 3 o'clock, the enemy is to be crushed by your fierce charge, destroyed by your grenades and bayonets. The honor of Belgrade, our capital, must not be stained. Soldiers, heroes. The Supreme Command has erased a regiment from its records. A regiment has been sacrificed for the honor of Belgrade and the fatherland. Therefore, you no longer need to worry about your lives. They no longer exist. So, forward to glory for the king and the fatherland. Long live the
Those who
king.
are about to die salute you.
Long live Belgrade." Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they failed.
Yeah, yeah.
Is the sad part of the whole this. They failed. I mean, I get really. This speech really gets to me. And well, But before we advance to the what I would like to call the second part of the war, I would like to ask you, well, how about the technological development in weapons, tactics, and medicine in the war?
Oh, that's actually an interesting point. This was, as far as I know, the first war in which morphine was extensively used.
Yes.
It was in the backstage, and also this war was the introduction of many modern weapons. First of all, machine guns, which made their appearance. Well, the first machine gun, I think, was a Gatling gun. It was the first ones fielded were in the American Civil War, but the use of the machine gun extensively was in the First World War.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
the use of this was also a war in which this is very interesting. The way that how both sides were looking for more innovative ways of killing people. For example, due to the extreme environment of the war, the machine gun and the mortars, some sides start to experiment with body armor. There are many examples of body armor,
It
and
looks really silly though when you see it.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
some of them look medieval in appearance. I saw one like it was an Italian soldier armor designed for trench raiders, and I mean you could easily see that you could easily saw that in a medieval scenario because it was a medieval armor. And when you give the fact that, for example, clubs, this is something, they make crude clubs made out of nails and cogwheel clubs. um, I even remember that there was this um, and in some cases soldiers even use spades to attack people. I remember that in one version of All Quiet on the Eastern Front, that it's like an 80s version or a 70s, I don't know. um, the old soldiers receive the new ones, and the new recruits are bringing with them serrated bayonets because
Yeah.
a bayonet alone is not enough. And the most veteran of all says, "Why you're using this? This don't work. These ones get stuck on the rib cage. You know
Yeah.
what you need to use? You need to use this." And he takes his spade and says, "You can use this. This is more effective than a knife." Because with this, you just need a clean hit on the neck and they're done for good.
Yeah, and of course, and now that you mention bayonets, also this was the first war that saw, well, not the first war, but one of the also saw the proliferation of bolt action rifles.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you could find in any army. I mean, also the Canadians had their own
Mm-hmm. The
Yeah.
the British had the British had the Lee
Enfield.
Enfield.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
And
Canadians had the Ross rifle, which was junk,
yeah,
and the
the,
Mexicans had the Mondragon.
the
yeah.
Mondragon, that's
It was a self-loading rifle, that one, but
it's actually one
mm,
of the best rifles in Battlefield One, by the way.
yeah, but in real life it was not so much, not so good, because it was like really delicate in its parts and its workings, and the dust and the mud from the trenches would actually ruin it.
Mm-hmm. Uh,
Also,
Other events, the planes.
well, I would like to mention really quickly about rifles. As you, Pablo, mentioned about the Russians having more soldiers than rifles, they actually they had the Mosin Nagant,
Mm-hmm.
which is a reliable rifle, as almost all the bolt action rifles from the war. But they also were in dire need of more rifles. So they ordered from the Americans some Winchester rifles, were converted Winchester rifles, the lever action rifles uh, the west from Western movies, and uh, and surplus Veterli Vitali Italian rifles that were fairly old and bad, because
Oh, yes.
those rifles were, some say, the cause of the defeat of the Italians in the war against Ethiopia.
Also, it was a single shot rifle,
Yeah.
basically. Um, but well, that's I mean that's funny that I was reading that one of the main weapons that the Russians still use during the war was the Berdan rifle. The Berdan rifle was a bolt action rifle that it was single shot, and this was the gun that most soldiers went to battle with. And it had a rate of fire of 6 to 8 rounds per minute. Compare that to what the other sides have. For example, the Lee Enfield. You have 10. That's actually the great advantage of the Lee Enfield. You have 10 rounds there when you need it. In fact, there's actually like a very interesting exercise that soldiers had that it was called the Mad Minute. I think it was like yes, it was firing 15 rounds at a target 300 yards away. For you, those of you who don't use the metric system, is 2,070 meters.
Yeah. Well, as you say, the planes in the game, well, in the war, um, were the first. The Germans have this in interesting mechanism that actually synchronize the rotor. How do you call it, Ernest? The la hélice.
Oh, sí. Ernest?
Um, Wait, Ernest.
Oh,
Left.
what?
Oh shit! Let me see what happened. Uh,
Oh, sorry guys, we're having um
Technical difficulties.
yes. Oh, what the hell? I think it was the Newfoundland police. They caught him talking shit about his soldiers, so they took him.
Uh,
Oh, where he?
well,
Um,
this thing synchronized the motor of the plane with the machine
yeah.
guns.
Mm-hmm. Because usually, that's actually true. Some soldiers end up before that ended up shooting their own rudders. But this is interesting about the plane. The guys who went to fight on plane, it was almost like some kind of nightly code, because in this battle in this at least in this fight it was they're trying to shoot down planes, not humans. They're not trying to kill. They're not there to kill the pilot. They're there to shoot down the plane, and it's a stark contrast of the butchery that you were seeing down on the ground.
Yeah,
For example, the red, and one of the most famous of all the pilots of the war was, of course, the Red Baron.
Manfred von Richthofen.
Richthofen, yes.
Yeah,
Interesting character, Richthofen. I remember that when he painted his plane red, everyone was thinking, it was saying, "What are you thinking? I mean, you can be seen everywhere." And he said, "Yes, because I want them to see when I'm coming for them." He led the Hasta Once, which was one of the wings of the Luftwaffe strike, I think, the German Imperial German Air Force back then.
yeah.
And I don't remember how many planes he shoot down, but I remember that the interesting thing is that how he got shot down is an interesting story. So the Red Baron, I think it was during the
Hmm.
if I remember correctly, it was during the battle of during the battle of the Somme, I
Sorry,
think.
guys. Cat ownership called.
Oh,
Yeah,
What?
my cat had a hairball.
oh, I
Oh,
see.
okay.
So sorry
Okay.
about that. What did I miss?
No,
Oh,
don't worry.
we were talking about planes in the war
Yes.
and the Red Baron
Okay, so the
and the
Red
flying
Baron
squadron.
has officially confirmed with 80 air combat victories. He shot down 80 Allied planes. he died young, at 25 years old. If I remember that when he was a pilot, during a battle, he was shot through the head, and that caused him to change his like his attitude. It was I remember that, and then how he died. This is actually an interesting story. So
He also, well, his brother also became a flight ace and flying ace.
mhm.
I think he only got 40 victories. But interesting fact, his hometown, Breslau, is now in Poland, the city of Wrocław.
So technically he's Polish.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so
Well, Erwin Rommel had a
so
Polish cousin,
yeah,
also
so
named Rommel.
okay, so let me see. Let me see. Okay, so I remember that I was reading about this, and you see, what happened was that during the Battle of the Somme, he was chasing a sub with camel, very low altitude, and during the battle, a rifle round, a 303 bullet, it went straight down the plane. It basically pierced his heart and lungs so severely that it caused a quick death. And he says that in his last seconds of life, he managed to retain sufficient control to make a rough landing. And
Yep.
there's actually in Wikipedia, there's a video of Australian soldiers examining the remnants of the plane. And the interesting thing is that when he was shot down, no one knew who did it. And I think I remember I found it that there was like a he was I think it was an Australian soldier. And the funny thing is that he lived all throughout his life with not knowing that he shot down the best pilot of the entire war. It's kind of like funny that no one could best him on the air, and the only one who shot him down was a guy on the ground who just shot through the air. He wasn't even aiming. I mean, he wasn't even aiming at him. He just shot through the air.
Yeah, it was an interesting character because also the Australians give the Red Baron proper burial.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, that's what I meant when I mentioned the thing about aerial combat, dogfights, and stuff. The fact that some kind of like knightly code back then. As I said, they weren't there to shoot down people; they were there to shoot down planes. I remember that there's a film about the Red Baron that shows that what a common practice he had, that when he shot down a plane, he went to the wreckage, and they usually took the guns of the plane as a trophy, and the canvas, in some cases, the canvas symbol of the plane they just shot down, because that was a common practice of pilots to paint several types of creatures and animals on the sides of the planes. And usually, when you shoot him down, you earn the right to have that as a trophy.
yeah, another innovation of the war that is worth mentioning are tanks.
Yes.
Oh, I think I don't know which was the first one, but the first one to be fielded was the famous the Mark IV.
And the Renaults also were a very good tank initially.
Yeah,
Yeah, the Renault is like it was like so small. You see it that way. But there were actually attempts before the war of trying to create armor vehicles. I mean, we have the so-called tank made by Leonardo, which was, I still don't know how that thing was supposed to work. But of course, the first tanks were the British ones, and I remember that these things, when they appear in the battlefield, I mean, you have to know the reaction that the people had. I mean, you're seeing basically a thing moving towards you, and there's nothing you have in your power to stop it. And but you have to think also that these tanks were made of a very rough production type, and So,
Yep.
for example, when sometimes the when German machine guns shot through the tanks, there were shards of the armor that went flying inside the tank. And I remember that there were some helmets that were actually made out of mail to protect the wearer's face of this deadly sharpener. But yes, the first prototype of tank was the Little Willie, and Little Willie was I would say like a track, like some kind of tractor. There's just one build, and it's now currently on the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. It was designed to just carry over
Mhm.
equipment, but it was the first it was the first completed tank prototype in history.
Yeah, and well, these tanks will prove crucial in the last compasses of the war, when the
Mhm.
Allies master the combined arms offensives. But another other aspects of technological innovation, I think, that will be worth mentioning are, the treatment of PTSD
Oh,
or
oh
shell shock,
yes, the shell
and
shock.
of course,
Hmm.
reconstructive plastic surgery went leaps and bounds forward with the war. Um, I think those could be you. Those could say I think you could say those were the most important technological advances or technical advances in the field of medicine.
I've seen videos about people with shell shock. There's even a video I've seen. I think it was one of the documentary that is about the World War One in color. It is one of the last episodes, and it shows men on a mental asylum. It shows a French man; he's completely fine, and then they show him a helmet, a French helmet, and he starts just to panic and scream. And you have to understand that how the war broke these men. And also I also saw shell shocked horses.
Yeah, and well, for example, it's important to note that at the start they were treating this as a disciplinary issue. Like the Germans would, in the people affected by in the ward where people affected by shell shock was interned in a hospital. They, for example, at 3 o'clock in the morning, they will enter barking orders and making them singing the national anthem to root out the cowardice, according to them.
Hmm.
At the end, well, it was started to be comprehensive. People started to comprehend that this was not a disciplinary issue. This was a mental issue, and the causes were really. There was a variation of causes. I mean, surviving that kind of bombardments. Mm, and supposedly the of officers were more propense to this to PTSD or shell shock than soldiers. I mean, they had the responsibility to care and direct for their men.
Yeah,
Uh,
they're leading them. They're expected to perform accordingly to certain
yeah,
standard.
yeah, and there was this story about the Los Battalion in the Argonne from the American Army, the battalion that advanced too much and, well, got trapped behind enemy lines. They managed to survive like 5 days, 6 days, until the relief force uh, saved them from the Germans there. But the commanding officer of that unit, which was Wall Street lawyer, was so traumatized by the experience. He he went to he committed suicide after the war because he was still affected by it. He thought he failed his men. Be- So,
Mm.
but I mean, and of course, another thing worth mentioning is the masks. They were made for the people that got disfigured in the war.
Yep, I've seen them.
And
I remember that there's this series I watched that is the Pacific, and one of the characters, Eugene Sledge, his father was a doctor during the First World War, and he's reluctant that his son goes to serve in the Second World War. And he says to his son that the men who fought in the First World War, it wasn't their bodies that were just mangled; it was their souls. I mean, the war destroyed not only destroyed their bodies, they destroyed their souls.
yeah,
It, that's the bigger effect, the broader and the awful effect about war. The
yeah.
fact that it doesn't have physical consequences; it has psychological consequences on all the ones who serve on it.
And of course, well, I think moving forward, we should move forward. I mean, what happened after all these after all these battles? Where we left after in 1917 when the Allies started their offensives on the Western Front, the Battle of Arras, the Nivelle Offensive, and the Battle of Passchendaele.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they didn't manage to broke the stalemate there, and Passchendaele was possibly the worst idea, one of the worst ideas of the war. Half a million troops, the British lost half a million troops just to gain 700 kilometers of terrain.
Yeah,
It was a really
it's
wasteful campaign. I mean, it was a really wasteful battle. It achieved nothing but a few kilometers of mud. Um, and I don't even know what to say on it. To be honest, it was just another useless war. Canada got thrashed in it. I
Yeah,
mean, they took significant losses,
uh,
despite having the brilliant Arthur Curry in charge.
yeah.
Edward, Ernest, you said that you had a relative of yours who served in the war.
In the Second World War, my grandfather was in the Royal Navy from 1939 to 45.
Oh, okay, okay,
Uh,
okay. So when we have to talk about the Second World War, we know where to start.
Okay,
Definitely, definitely.
and well, on the Italian front, as we said, the Germans and the Austrians managed to break the stalemate at the Battle of Caporetto, but I think they overstretched there because they that actually came to bite them in the ass. Sorry,
Yeah.
in Montegrappa and Vittorio Veneto.
El Resurgimiento.
Yeah, I mean because Caporetto in Italy prompted a national crisis that they were looking for to to pin the responsibility of the defeat in anybody um, after the war. Even Luigi Cadorna, the field marshal from the Italian army, was another Sir Douglas Haig, an incompetent uh, an incompetent military.
And another one.
Yeah, and he didn't even care to to see what their troops were doing. I mean, he blamed his troops after the defeat in Caporetto, and and then was replaced by Armando Diaz as commander of the Italian army there. Also in Russia, what we can say, they,
I mean, the revolution came forth,
and the
overthrew the. Sorry.
and the country fell apart, and they finally um, surrender with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and
Hmm.
The Romanians too surrender with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
Yep, they did.
No, no, sorry, the Treaty of Bucharest. And well, and this help in a way to the Germans because they have food and supplies they could use, and they were in dire need from.
Hmm.
And then when the Germans decided to implement the unrestricted submarine warfare and tried to convince this humble country, mi casa su casa, Mexico, uh, to join the war, and with the promises of taking back some of the lost territory, they were well. Mexico at the start actually considered the plan, and the President Venustiano Carranza actually form a commission to evaluate a war with the U.S.
Oh.
They say that the U.S. was way too powerful, so they decided against and reiterate their neutrality. And this was the moment when the United States entered the war.
That was after the sinking of the Lusitania.
Also,
It's
uh,
funny that it was. It's funny that it was like a
2 years
um,
prior.
2 years prior, and I've heard that supposedly the ship had ammunition, and that's why the reason why the Germans sunk the ship. But at the moment, the Allies say no, no, no. It wasn't that. It wasn't because of it. But then later investigation showed yes, there were munitions being held in the Lusitania.
Yeah, and of course, so when the Americans entered the war, the Germans were, in dire need of finishing the war before they got to Europe. So they began their spring offensive, or
Mhm.
Yep, they did.
as they call it, the Kaiserschlacht, the Battle of the Kaiser, and it actually almost knocked England and France out of the war. They were stopped at Amiens, and of course the first encounter of between Germans and American troops, the Battle of Good.
Oh yes, if I remember correctly, when the Germans fought against the Americans, they didn't expect it that they counter attack with such ferocity. I think they called them the Devil's Hund, devils from hell.
Yeah, and well, when Pershing ordered their troops forward in Good, and they came across retreating French soldiers and officers, saying the war was over and the Germans had won and everything. A French officer told an American officer, "What are you doing? Turn back! Don't go there." And the Americans, in their no nonsense style of confronting life, tell him, "Not going there, man. But we just arrived here."
Mm-hmm.
And well,
You're just going to escape from the party.
yeah, and well, we're mentioning also that almost all the generals from the American Army in World War II uh, first saw action here. Patton, uh, and also
McDuffie.
MacArthur, Jack Dempsey.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them saw action there because after these defeats of Germany in Amiens and Bellegut, the Allies started the 100 Days Offensive that took them beyond the River Marne. And well, the Americans did something in one of these in his sector, the Meuse-Argonne sector, that
Mm-hmm.
actually was a sound strategy because, and it was like common sense. Do you remember what happened in Verdun and the Somme? That they started the British in the Somme and the Germans Verdun, started shelling their enemy positions non-stop for
Yeah,
weeks. Some,
previous to the previous to the battle. Yes.
yeah. So what they did, what the French and the Germans did in any case, just reinforce the sectors they were pounding with artillery, and expect when they charge, and it worked. And what the Americans did here, okay, 3 hours of artillery bombardment and wet bands. The Germans didn't expect it. At
They expected to last longer, like days of bombings.
Yeah, and that was a well. After this offensive, it was the last. Mm, it was the last. The one of the last battles of the war, and until this day, the day of mm, on this day 100 years ago, uh, the well, the Germans raised a white flag and decided to sign an armistice. Of course, the French, uh, Ferdinand Foch, the high commander of the Allied troops, decided to press the Germans for everything. They basically had to surrender a lot of uh, war equipment and industrial equipment. It was a it was a really how to say uh, a sad state of affairs
Yes.
because the sorry uh, the uh, the armistice was signed at 5 o'clock in the morning French time, but the Allies they decided to attack the Germans until the armistice came into effect at 11 o'clock. So
Wait.
it
What?
it was a really stupid thing to do.
It is. But why they did that?
Yeah, and of course it was um, a sad thing to a really sad thing because the Germans agreed to evacuate the positions that they were being they were being attacking in that day. I mean, the last American soldier to die in that day was was a guy that was charging to a machine gun nest from in the German lines, and the Germans were telling him, "Stop! The army, the armistice is going to come into effect in seconds. Don't do it! Don't do it!" And when he was upon them, better him than me. So, yeah.
Wow. But I mean, like when the war ended, I mean the worst treaty, to kind of like start wrapping us up because I mean we were a little we're doing pretty good, but
Yeah, don't worry. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah,
but
just well
yeah,
to
go on.
mention.
Sorry.
Um, by that time, all the allies of Germany were all the Central Powers was that alliance was crumbling down. I mean, you have the armistice of Salonika, where Bulgaria surrendered to the Allies. Mudros, where the Ottomans surrendered. Villa Giusti, where Austria-Hungary surrendered, and of course, this armistice we were talking just about. And they all signed separate treaties, but the harshest one
Was
was
Versailles.
no doubt. I mean, also Bulgaria in his treaty was forced to cede the Aegean coast they held, and some lands to Serbia. Well, Austria-Hungary was totally was no more. I mean, it was a bunch of states by that time, but Hungary and Austria signed two separate treaties, Trianon and Saint Germain, and well, and the Ottomans signed the Treaty of Sevres that actually it included the Sykes-Picot Treaty by dividing the Middle East in between the French and the British, and dividing basically all the Anatolia peninsula in zones of influence for each of the allies. And I think the allies also promised Greece a little of what they call the Megale idea, the great idea of a Prime Minister Venizelos, which was annexing all the Anatolian lands that were once part of the Byzantine Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And well, just to mention quickly this Treaty of Sevres. Well, it became unenforceable because Mustafa Kemal Ataturk actually rebelled and fought all the allies out of Turkey, and they got a new treaty in the Treaty of Lausanne. That it was a change, well, like a modification for the Treaty of Sevres. But going back to the main treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Yeah, I think the British overreach with that particular treaty.
Well, the French didn't like it. They thought it wasn't harsh enough. But the thing is that as we know,
they want to just if it was for them, they would basically destroy Germany out of existence, making it non-existent.
Yeah.
But you see, the thing is that it gave the rise of the stab in the back theory, which led to, of course, everyone's favorite Austrian, Adolf Hitler.
Yep.
Yeah. Motherfucker.
Yeah, me burn in hell.
Yeah, and also the first elected by this time, the Kaiser has abdicated and flee to the Netherlands. The first elected government of Germany and its head, Philipp Schiedemann.
The Weimar Republic.
Yeah, and before the Weimar Republic, this guy, when he was presented the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, he rather resigned from his post rather than sign the treaty. And I can't blame him. I mean, it's a harsh thing to do.
No, that was the worst treaty. It was a Carthaginian peace, is what it was.
Totally. I mean, the treaty was designed to cripple Germany for forever. It didn't work.
No, it didn't, because at the end, the Weimar Republic found ways to get around the restrictions.
And well, also Friedrich Ebert, the second president of Germany, actually before signing the treaty, asked Paul von Hindenburg if the army was in any shape to continue the war. And he said, no, we can't.
Well, no one really could. Everyone was tired out. This was a massive waste of humanity.
Yeah.
And it literally did ruin even though Newfoundland was on the winning side, it ruined us, because the British, we had to pay for the military expenditures. And Mother England was not too willing to forgive the debts that we rang up while fighting her war, which led to economic problems here. which then were magnified by the Great Depression, which then caused a riot that nearly killed one of the prime ministers, which then brought in another government that then gave up control of Newfoundland to the British, who then essentially gave us to Canada, give or take a referendum.
Mm-hmm.
So the war had really wide ranging effects, even amongst the victors, which was good and bad.
Yeah, and also, well, I mean, I think you could say this war and this treaty put the entire world in a spiral of violence and war that we are still living its consequences.
Mm-hmm.
The way the Middle East was divided among the victors, Italy and their theory of the Vittoria Mutilata, which was basically the Allies not fulfilling their side of the London Secret Treaty, because they were promised all the Adriatic coast of the um, and Austrian Empire. They got the south portion of Tyrol, Trieste, and nothing more,
Mhm.
because I think they also were promised some German colonies. Portugal also, for the war, I think they only got a insignificant piece of land from the German East Africa. The Brazilians got the ship the ships they captured from Germany, and the British got the lion's share of the treasure. Half the German colonies for them, half for the French. The which else the Middle East and its oil fields.
Yep. Everything to
Uh,
the British.
yeah,
Well, I mean, to
and
the victor, the spoils, you know.
yeah, but I and by victis to the Germans, they have to, well, uh, the nation of Poland was appeared on the map again after almost 120 years, and also all the and they have to see this, a lot of territory, and also the city of Danzig, which was an important harbor in the Baltic Sea, all their colonies. I mean, the Germans, for throughout the war, and they never sent. I mean, they experienced starvation and scarcity of some things, but they never felt they were being defeated.
Yeah.
Uh,
In fact, we can all agree that the Versailles Treaty just basically, I mean, it paved the ground for the next war. And we should realize, for example, it was, I mean, if it was up to the French, France will be, Germany will be divided between the nations and cease to exist.
yeah,
But the British were, no, 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 no. We need to keep Germany. Just we don't need to. But and let's remember this: the treaty just basically blamed everything on Germany because presumably Germany made the first blow. No, it was the
the Serbians.
Serbians who did the first blow, and then the Austro-Hungarians followed it, and then the Germans followed it. It wasn't the Germans who escalated the violence. It was later the British and the French who declared war on Germany. So,
And
you
the
know.
Russians too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Austrians before the war make the provision that no land will be annexed by the Austro-Hungarians if they won the war against Serbia. So they would just they would, the Russian ambitions there in the Balkans were an important factor why they decided to join, because Serbia was their only proxy there.
Mm-hmm.
And also this was really stupid, because months earlier from the start of the war, Tsar Nicholas and King George were in Berlin for the wedding of the daughter of the Kaiser, with visiting his cousin Willie.
That
Uh,
it's kind of crazy how these things happened
yeah,
and how it led up to it. Um, but it's really all you can do now because I mean it was just the way the war was
Yep.
yeah,
War is hell.
that it is.
and well, just to
You
wrap.
know,
Yeah,
I, I kind of like what to say that what is it? Well, it's mostly had to say to do with exactly how we perceive the war because I've been seeing now currently there's this trend that really scares me of trying to I will say like soften history in a way. I've been seeing it recently, for example, when in certain games or certain movies they're starting to mute Nazi imagery
yeah,
like swastikas on planes, and I think that they could do the same with World War One. And the thing is that I come from a place, an idea that we should learn history as it was, as it's dark, grim, and gritty as it was. We should learn it how it was, not how we wanted it to be. And so I hope that when people learn about the war, I think that I hope that they do it for a broader scope. For example, and I talk about you guys before we started the podcast. It was the, for example, that Macron on the remembrance about the war said that it was nationalism was a what caused World War One, and that is exactly what I'm trying to talk about. That they people like not like Macron, but we know you know what people are talking about are trying to basically retell this history in a way that suits them. And today, now we're living in times in which the people are striking against globalism and identity politics. It seems very uh, accurate to say, "Oh yes, nationalism caused the worst conflict in human one or the worst conflict in human history." Which look, I would say that is just partially right, but nationalism is just one of the thousands of reasons why the war happened. It's not the only one.
yeah,
Wars do not begin. I mean, you need a ton of reasons to start a war. No, no, you need you need one excuse to start a war, but there has to be like an entire context for that war to happen. And in the case of the First World War, nationalism was just one. So that's my thought that we should. That's my thought, and I say this to everyone that we should not be shy to talk about sensitive topics about, for example, the First World War. We should not be seeing it through this uh, scope that we see things in modern time. We should see it as how it was. It was a conflict with deep rooted causes, not only nationalism, and people died, as it always been. Yes.
yeah, and it's important to tell their story, to learn from their mistakes and and their experiences.
And
Yep.
not to commit the
Yeah,
same thing. I don't
Now,
want
if
to
if
get stuck on a trench.
well, you see, but you see, you're partly the cause of a potential South American World War One scenario because you guys also took some land from a certain group of people who really want some land back.
and that war was caused by Bolivia.
Yeah, but you
I know
see,
that's Bolivia's
yeah, but don't you see the
that's Bolivia's
parallels?
fault.
Don't you see the parallels? So now you're gonna have like Bolivian. I'm not gonna say, well, you know who I'm talking about. Instead of a mustache, it's gonna be like a cocalero. But
Yes.
yeah, like he's going to lead the great new army of the Bolivian Reich.
Los Sturmtruppen.
No, they're going to be called Papa Troopens
Pampa troopers.
or Coca Troopers because they're all going to be hopped up on coke. But anyway,
Yeah.
guys, this has been an awesome stream.
Yeah.
We somehow
Yeah.
managed to cover, the majority of it. We missed one or two pieces, but I mean, when you have a limited time, you've got to.
You can do so much.
Yeah, I mean,
You can.
yeah.
Okay, I would like to finish. Well, this stream saying that we dedicate it to the people that serve in the war, that selflessly
Everyone.
that selflessly sacrifice their lives for a greater good, as
Yep.
they saw it. And if you indulge me, I would like to read the transcript of the single player campaign epilogue from Battlefield 1. It's titled Rem- Remember Us.
Yep.
It says, one day all this will be over. The war to end all wars will be won by one side or the other. The guns will rust, grass will grow, and there'll be nothing left of any of this. The land will heal itself, as everything does in the end. We'll be long gone by then, but maybe not forgotten.
Oh,
Um, Sorry,
No, don't worry, we
no.
understand.
Go on,
it,
man.
it gets to me. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, he,
Look.
yeah,
Please go on.
yeah. History only remembers one in 1,000 of us. Then the future will be filled with the stories of who we were and what we did. Sorry.
No. It's if you don't feel like to do it, there's no need.
It's almost how we live, how we fought, how we died. When this is all over and the war is gone, they will remember us. But until that day comes, we will stand. We will look that in the eyes, and we will fight. Thank you.
No, thanks, man.
Bro, man.
Thanks.
Sorry, and sorry for the emotional
No.
moment.
We understand. We understand.
These stories of
That's
sacrifice really get me.
No,
you know
yeah, no. It. I've
it
I've
is.
heard them.
I mhm.
It's like
It's kind of
even
sad that
my. Sorry.
it's kind of sad that but that's real, and that's something that for me at least, someone who likes to read about history, there are many stories out there that we don't know about, and I think that we should go out and remember it, because there were not only British and Germans who fought in this war. There were Indians, Africans, Arabs, Turks. Every one of them had their stories. In fact, this reminds me of a video watch in YouTube. Do you guys remember Crown and Tea?
Yeah.
So yeah, well, no, but he made a video in which he gave his experience, of course, as a German, basically, about how he experienced the game, and he said that when the tagline was "Remember our stories," he said, "Then why there is no campaign about the Austrians? I mean, they had stories on their own." And I say that that's the thing we should avoid to do. We should avoid to just talk about the British, about the French. We should talk about everyone who fought in this war,
Yeah,
as as small his the role were. Like the new soldiers from Newfoundland. I've never heard in my life that Newfoundland was a nation that fought in the war. And now I know, and we should tell the stories. I mean, because look, guys, I know that in 10 years' time, I doubt that there's going to be a war, and I doubt that I pulled a rifle and just go to fight and kill anyone who somehow declares war on Chile. But I know that I don't want another kind of conflict like that, and I know that I don't want my sons to live in a war like that. So, by learning about our mistakes in the past, we can fix the present, and,
Like
and just as a
sorry.
no. Tell me, Jay, I already finished.
Like speaking about like the different stories now, I know this is a bit off topic, but it's like my own, like when my grandfather was serving in the Navy, while he was on shore leave, he went drinking with a few of his shipmates, and this was during the Blitz. So I mean, the bombs are going off all over London and all over like the UK,
Oh yes.
and so apparently, grandfather went back to the pub after the guys were leaving, or he was heading back to the pub because he forgot something in there, or something. I don't know the exact thing he was looking for, but he said to his shipmates, he said, "Go on ahead, and I'll catch up to you." So he goes back down the street, and a bomb goes off and killed his shipmates, and he didn't die. So it wiped out, a couple of his very good friends.
Oh God.
So I mean,
Wow.
and I don't know if he carried a lot of that trauma through his life. Because I never met him. He died, in the 70s, before I was born. But he did drink. Now that might have been because he was in the Navy, or it just might have been because he felt guilty about different things. He apparently survived a sinking ship as well. I have to try to find his service records. They're really hard to find, and I'd like to get them, but apparently he saw some stuff and did some stuff and all kinds of things that I don't know if I could ever understand, but you know for someone to go through an entire conflict, from start to finish, like he did. I mean, it has to have some impact on you.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and like the town I'm
As I
from,
said. Mhm.
actually, like if it wasn't even for the war, I wouldn't be here because my grandmother's first husband was killed by a German U-boat, and
Oh.
then when my grandfather got back from the war, he moved to my hometown, and met her, and had my father, and all that. So I mean, the war, well, both the First World War and the Second World War has an impact on my family. So it's a lot to think about. When you think about your circumstances and where you're from and how everything relates into it. But guys, I think on that note, we'll end it because it is
Yeah.
no longer the
Nice.
100th anniversary. It is now the 100th anniversary and a couple of hours.
Yes.
So, thank you
In
guys
fact, I don't
for.
know. I don't know if you listened, but there's like an audio in Twitter that like sound recordings from when the guns fell silent when the armistice happened, and I don't know how be. I like to like picture myself being in that moment. Let's imagine like you are a British soldier. You've been like 4 years on the trenches, and then for 1 second, silence. It's not like a silence before the storm. No, it's just simple silence. There's nothing in the air. There's no plane. There's no artillery. Nothing. In fact, I remember that I watched a Lego animation that it's actually very funny. It's a Lego animation. It's not on the armistice, but it's about during Christmas of the Christmas truce. This common practice that soldiers made during the war, and it was funny. It was the Lego so there were Lego figures, and some of them there it was Christmas, and then they saw the Germans. They were coming out of the trenches, and they were saying, "Hi, Merry Christmas," and then they start playing football. And I don't know if something like that happened when the armistice came about, but just imagine being 4 years stuck in a trench. You lived through hell, and now there's nothing. Silence. It's
It's
over. It's over.
Yeah. It's that's one thing why so many veterans cannot sometimes reintegrate to civil life because like they forgot how to live in a peacetime society.
Yeah, they lived through war for a long time. I mean, they That's why they did. That's what they were trained to do. So they don't know what to do. But guys, I thank you a lot for your time. This was I would say a fun stream and an interesting one. And I hope that when the time comes about, we can do one about the Second World War. But I hope that the next stream is going to be more about uh, memes and jokes and whatever is going on in Europe by the time.
I agree. I think we're going to start now to see a return to the original content. The original reason we did this up to, just have a good time and
Yeah, but this was a
talk
good
about
moment
how
too.
horribly corrupt
It
South
was
America
a moment
is.
to be serious.
Yeah. Thank you for watching.
Yep.
Thanks, Lama. Thanks, Pala.
Yeah. Good
Thanks.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.